Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Horse Show Wire podcast. I am Jackie Hale. My co-host is Shane Darnell, and today we're going to be talking about the USEF Safe Sport Policy updates, in particular the Minor Athlete Abuse Prevention Policies, or MAAP. Our special guests today are Melissa Moore of Sunrise Stables in Versailles, Kentucky, and Tamara Tucker of Tucker Law Firm in Charlottesville, Virginia. Tammy specializes in appellate, business, and equine law. She also serves as general counsel and advisor to Equine Sports Council. So, Tammy, we're going to let you start us off with an overview of the new MAAP policies.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. Today we will cover some of what I think are probably going to be the most commonly encountered parts of the new MAAP policy, the Minor Athlete Abuse Prevention Policy. And sort of from a big picture perspective, essentially the federal government has instructed Safe Sport, and Safe Sport has instructed the NGBs to put into place policies that go to a couple of things. One, reporting child abuse, making members, USEF members, mandatory reporters, which we've known about. And two, specifically implementing policies that deal essentially with one-on-one interactions between minors and adults. We're going to talk about those one-on-one interactions in terms of meetings that take place at horse shows, individual training sessions that take place at horse shows, what we call sort of the observable and interruptible standard. We'll talk about out-of-program context. In other words, if you're giving a lesson at home, what are the recommended practices that USEF has made? We'll also talk about the social media and electronic communications policy, which will have a pretty big impact on how trainers interact with their students. And then we will also talk about the local travel policy. There's a travel policy in the rules that relates to team travel, which is if you're going with a USEF, like a Young Riders team or something like that, to an event. But there's also a local travel policy that will have an effect on trainers that may ride in a vehicle with minors, may pick them up and take them to the barn for lessons. And we'll talk about those types of things as well. The first section, and probably the most important section, is the mandatory parts of the one-on-one interaction rule. And the first thing you have to consider is who are the applicable adults. That's the term that USEF has come up with, and other NGBs have used as well. So who do these policies apply to? And it applies to adult members who have what is called regular contact with minor amateur athletes. And there is no definition for regular contact. There's no definition in the federal statute. There's no definition by USEF. There's no definition by Safe Sport. And so what the policies say you should consider in trying to figure out if you are an adult who has regular contact is whether you're an adult that's got a position of, or you're in a position of authority over a minor, you're a trainer. If you're an adult that's likely to be in a chaperoned one-on-one situation with the minor, or if you're an adult that's going to have reoccurring contact with the minor to an extent where they could develop a trusting relationship. And that would apply to probably a lot of adults. The horse community is, a lot of times a multi-generational community. And so, we adults have friends, might have kids that ride, and we have friends with kids that ride, and we all interact with one another. So I would say that to err on the side of including oneself as an applicable adult and follow the policies, whether you think you have quote-unquote regular contact or not. Other applicable adults, as you can imagine, are anybody that's authorized by USEF to interact with minors, like a team coach. adult members at a facility, at a horse show, show management, and then adult staff and board members of USEF itself. So once you figure out that you're an applicable adult, what are you allowed to do and not allowed to do? And the first section of the rule is the observable and interruptible section. And this talks about that you're prohibited from having one-on-one interactions with a minor at a facility, partially or fully under USEF's jurisdiction, or at a USEF-sponsored activity, unless your interaction is at an observable and interruptible distance with another adult. In other words, is there somebody else around that can see you and the minor interacting? There's also a provision that ties into the individual training sessions that may occur at a horse show, which I'll cover in the next section. One of the things that I think first thing that comes to mind is giving lessons to students and helping them warm up for horse shows. And from a trainer's perspective, what is observable and interruptible? What does that even mean? And USEF has set forth sort of these three prongs to look at. And it says, wherever possible, the trainer should keep a physical distance from an athlete to ensure that there's no allegation of inappropriate physical contact. Well, we all know that when you teach somebody to ride, you're going to have physical contact with them. Also, if you teach somebody to play golf or tennis or anything like that, when you're teaching people to participate in a sport, it's hard not to do things like adjust someone's riding position, to walk up to them at the gate and say, hey, you need to put your leg here, put your heel down, and you put your hand on their leg. Or you need to shorten your reins and you put your hand on their hands to show them where their rein length needs to be. What USEF says about that is that if that physical contact is required to do your job as a trainer, you have to ask the athlete permission before you do it. And the contact should be in full view of other people. Most of the time at a show, I think that the full view is going to happen. You're going to have, folks around you. And I think that it's going to be a little bit of a learning curve for trainers. Have to say, hey, Susie, I need to adjust your riding position. Do I have your permission to touch you? And everybody's going to have to get used to that, I guess. The third prong that they talk about is if words of admonishment are required. They say seeking a third party as a witness is advisable. That's kind of a squishy prong to me. I'm 50 years old and I get yelled at by my trainer all the time. So it's hard not to participate in a sport and not get admonished. I'm not really sure what a witness does other than possibly protect you from allegations later on down the road. So I'd be interested in hearing Melissa's take on this section of the rule concerns from a trainer's perspective, because that's who's really impacted by this policy.
I was just, actually a few things happened at the last show I was at, which was this past week, and I had a friend of mine's daughter came back to the barn, and she left her there to clean tack, and it was just me and her. Now, she's a friend of mine, and it's her daughter. So these are things that we don't think of. It's not in our mindset to think we have to have another person here with us while this girl is sitting there cleaning tack and I'm nearby. And I'm probably is not their intention of the rule, but it's a lot for a trainer to get used to, because we have grown up. I grew up in this business. I grew up going to horse shows with my mom and dad, and a lot of my friends came with us. And it's just, it's a family outing. It was a way of life. And so now we're changing everything. So I think it's a lot for us horse trainers to get used to, is now that we have to ask a minor for their permission to adjust their leg or move their hips or something that is not sexual in any way. But all of a sudden USEF is making us feel bad, or not USEF, but Safe Sport is making us feel bad that we're doing this, or scared to touch somebody, or scared to instruct someone. And I think that it's going to be a very big inconvenience for a lot of people, and I think it's going to hurt how we teach. I don't think these children are going to get the best instruction that we could possibly give them, mentally and physically. I mean, I don't think that they're going to feel a part of a team. I don't know. There's a lot that goes into all of this.
Tammy, to Melissa's point, is there a way that the riders can sign with their parents, both sign a instruction waiver that says the instructor you're okay with the instructor adjusting your leg or being able to touch your body to help you in your riding event or something like that? That way, because sometimes it unfolds so quickly and so fast. What if a horse is rearing up, or they've got to grab a rider and rip them off a horse? You don't have time to ask.
So there is an exception for emergency circumstances in the one-on-one interaction rule, and that's exactly for the reason that you just described. If a horse is acting up, or if you're back at the barn and a child has an emergency medical event, this policy is not designed to have you stand there and watch a child who needs CPR, and you call 911 and wait for somebody else to get there before you administer CPR. So there is an emergency circumstances, and certainly, if a horse and rider are in a dangerous situation and you can get a minor out of that situation by physical contact, by all means, a trainer should do that. You need to pull somebody out of the way or something like that.
My question is, how can we ask a minor, though, like if we're, getting ready to go in the ring and I need to adjust her leg, how can we ask them for permission? How can they give us permission? That's a concern.
Yeah, I think that's a question for you, Seth. I understand, because they are a minor.
Right.
And, on the one hand, you're saying they can't make decisions and they need the protection of adults and, or permission of the parents. But on the other hand, this seems to indicate that you can ask the minor themselves, because they are the athlete, before you adjust a riding position, for their permission. With regard to sort of advanced permission by written consent for physical contact, no, I don't see that the rules allow for that. There are limited circumstances that we'll talk about where you can, a parent can give written permission in advance for certain interactions, but I don't see where it's allowable for physical touching in advance.
There's a trainer that's here in Kentucky that travels with one of their young clients, and they have taken on a position. They've got legal guardianship. So how does that work? So if you get legal guardianship, then it's fine, right?
Correct.
That's a lot to do. But if it's a child that travels with you a lot or stays with you a lot, I guess that's an option.
Well, if they don't have parents. But in most states, the legal guardianship is in lieu of parents. In other words, a minor can't have 6 legal guardians plus parents. They have parents, but they also have legal guardianship of them. And maybe that's different in their state. I don't think I don't know that every state deals with that issue that way.
This is just such a huge thing especially for our industry, because we have academy shows and we have academy classes which are for mostly children, but adults showing them as well. And they are at USCF shows or affiliated shows, and it's just it's going to change how we have to interact. And I'm scared. I have to tell you.
To your point, Melissa, the Lead Line Academy trainers are constantly grabbing their arm around the back of a child's rear end, or holding their leg, or grabbing them. And you're not going to be able to ask a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old, "I'm going to touch you. Is that okay?" You don't have time.
Right.
Yeah, and again, there would have to be some nexus between a USEF function, USEF jurisdiction, and what's going on. These policies don't apply to that, even though the trainers that are employed there are USEF members. When they go out and teach an up-downer lesson, I don't read these policies as requiring them with a ring of 8 kids, with the helpers going and saying, I need to teach you how to hold the reins. Can I touch you? Because those kids that are taking lessons are not minor amateur athletes.
So that would fall under the recommended practices, but not the required.
Exactly.
Okay.
Which we'll get to at the end of the one-on-one interaction section.
And is that true even if it was at a USCF show when they were doing the lead line classes?
So that's different. I think you make a good point, because I think a lead line class at a USCF show, that's a USCF show, so these policies apply. So that's a really good point, and that's why it's so important to have trainer input, because you all think of things because this is what you do. You're going to think of a lot of scenarios that may not have been contemplated or may have been overlooked in crafting these policies. And I have to tell you, I don't envy anyone having to craft these policies for our industry, because it's a lot easier to do it for meets or even soccer or golf, because even though there's physical contact, the way in which the organizational structure is just so much more limited, and the potential for just these kind of weird gray areas. So the tack cleaning, that's a great question. My personal take on it, and one thing I did last week for a client, is that the juniors often do help learn horse care. They learn to bandage, they learn to clean tack. In my opinion, that constitutes an individual training session, because you are learning things. So an individual training session does not necessarily just apply to riding, in my opinion. It can apply to other aspects of horsemanship. And you can get written permission in advance for one-on-one contact for individual training sessions. So I included that in the definition in a permission slip for a one-on-one individual training session that was for riding, showing, warming up in the schooling area, cleaning tack, I actually said that, bandaging, bathing the horses, and all other aspects of horse care, where they might be with, one of my clients who are professional trainers and adults, learning how to do those things. That would take care of the tack cleaning situation, in my opinion.
Question: when I read all of it, how often do you have to update these permission slips, these forms?
Every 6 months.
Do you have to do them is it blanketed to cover, like you said, so it's blanketed to cover all activities? You don't have to have special ones for certain things, or the way you're writing them, it's just going to cover everything? I guess it depends on who writes it.
It depends on that, and the conversation I had with the other lawyer who was also doing one, we talked about where we would separate and do separate ones. We talked about travel, how we would probably do something separate for travel, how we might do separate ones for individual training sessions at shows versus out-of-program contacts, or we might put them all together. But it really just depends on each barn and what they actually do, how many kids they have, and what they do with those kids. That's why I don't really think just sort of having a template thrown out there is going to get it done, because I think every barn that wants to try to have a permission slip of some kind doesn't want to just say to the parents, okay, you guys have to be here all the time, that wants to try to accommodate the parents in some way really needs to consult with a lawyer to go through these and figure out what works best for them.
So, Tammy, just to be clear, it's not so much that we need permission slips for at-home activity. That's under the preferred guidelines, that activity at home, giving lessons at home, having fun shows at home on your private property. It's when you travel or you attend a USCF event that you should have permission slips in place, correct?
that you have to have permission slips in place for an individual training session unless you're going to be in an observable and interruptible location.
And that includes
That includes what?
at-home instruction?
No, that's under the recommended practices
Okay.
at home. But I mean, I certainly have included that to include at home and at shows, because as long as you're going to get the permission for one, you might as well get the permission for the other. One of the contexts I think people need to consider at this point, or trainers need to consider, and this is why I said I really think it's important for each barn to consult with a lawyer, is that it isn't, in my opinion, just a matter at this point of complying or trying to figure out and comply with these policies. What you also want to do is set yourself up so that you have done the maximum amount and not the minimum amount. Because if at some point, whether it's a safe sport complaint that's filed, or people have to remember that in every state that I know of, but certainly in the states that I'm licensed in, unlawful touching is sexual battery or battery, and then it may be of a sexual nature. And those can give rise not only to criminal complaints, but to civil claims as well. And so, you know, if you have done sort of the bare minimum, one of the things that could be explored, and I'm not giving my full legal analysis on this because haven't seen it play out yet, but one of the things that could be explored in a civil action in discovery is, hey, trainer so-and-so, you're the defendant because we say that you sexually battered a 16-year-old child, you unlawfully touched them. You are a USEF member, are you not, Mr. or Mrs. Trainer? Yes. Okay, and you're familiar with these policies? Yes. You read those policies? Yes. Did you seek permission to do this? Did you ask the minor? Did you ask the parent in advance to have a one-on-one training session? And if the answer is, well, I didn't think I had to, it was a recommended practice, but not a required practice, that's not the greatest look for a defendant in a civil action. So that's a different context to keep in mind, that it isn't simply, in my mind at this point, just about complying with the new policies. It's also about a bigger picture of the world is changing, and if a civil action is brought against you, this may be fodder for a plaintiff's attorney to explore.
What has our world come to?
No, it's terrifying. It makes you want to close up your doors and go hide in a hole. I mean, it's very scary. So, how does a form protect us from safe sport? So let's say I have a form. This child is some child has accused me of something, but yet I have a form that says I have permission to do the whole permission to do whatever, teach. And anyway, I'm accused of something, and then how does that protect me?
The only thing it protects you from is you haven't violated a part of the rule. You haven't violated the rule that says you cannot be one-on-one with this child unless you have a permission slip for an individual training session. Now remember, it isn't one-on-one for other things like travel, which we'll talk about. So I don't think the permission slip, I don't think people should necessarily look at it like protection, because if the parent has given you permission to have a one-on-one training session with the child, that's what the permission is for. If something occurs during that one-on-one session, or the child alleges that something occurs during the one-on-one session, the only thing that permission slip has done is excused you from violating the rule where you weren't supposed to be with the child by yourself in the first place. But is it evidence that something didn't happen during that one-on-one session? No, it's not. It isn't like you're going to walk into Safe Sport and say, oh, I had a permission slip. So
Right.
therefore, her allegations or his allegations are out the window. That isn't how that's going to
So the
work.
best practice is to make sure you always have another person with you, because it's just frightening for me. I don't ever want to be alone with a child ever. I mean, I don't care where ever. I don't want. It frightens me that I hugged a child at the last horse show that I hadn't seen in a while. I see pictures on Facebook of people kissing their riders when they win. I'm thinking, how does that look? I mean, it's just everything has changed. I just saw a bunch of pictures today of a trainer up at Indy hugging her 12 and under rider, or wrapping her arms around her waist.
But they weren't alone, and that's the difference. So when you're not alone with the child, and the child comes out of the class and has won. Yeah, that's, it's natural, depending on the relationship, for some people to get excited and hug the child, or for the child to hug the trainer, or parents to hug, or whoever. But there's people around, and there's evidence that there was no wrongdoing. So what these policies are getting at is greater risk is when you are in a one-on-one situation where no one else is around. And
right.
I think with regard to the permission slip for individual training sessions, or later on for any sort of travel, people really need to do that if they have a trusting, good relationship with that family or client. And some people do. Some people are comfortable. They're not worried about it. They have, had this client for a really long time, and they just are willing to, take what risk there is in being one-on-one with that person. And for some of them, they've just gotten the permission just in case there's another adult, and that adult walks away for a minute, and all of a sudden wham, you're one-on-one, kind of like your tack cleaning situation.
Right.
But yeah, I don't think you're going to see an end to those displays of affection because they're in public.
Tammy, what's your opinion on at a lot of our horse shows, most of them, in fact, we travel in RVs or buses, and depending on the trainer and the parent situation, if the trainer has kids, I've seen it where there'll be 5 other kids around the horse show staying the night in their bus with them, and be full of girls or whatever the situation. And in fact, myself and my partner, we've had an RV full of kids before. Does that need to stop? Or, is that risky behavior now?
Well, I think if we jump ahead to the local travel rule and the team travel rule, because the team travel rule talks about staying in hotels, which I would say would be, it says or other sleeping arrangements, so that would be the RV. And I'm assuming that they meant to include that language also under the local travel rule. So the team travel rule is for USEP team kind of stuff, and that's not everybody. That's very few. So I would say to just follow that. And what this says is it talks about you shouldn't share a hotel room or other sleeping arrangement with a minor. Obviously, if you're related, that's okay. A parent can consent to such an arrangement in advance and in writing. And again, it talks about like the 2 deep leadership. That's kind of the phrase, which talks about having a couple of people there. So I think with regard to the situation that you're proposing, it's not directly addressed, in my opinion, by these policies. What I would do would be to follow the strictest policy, and I think you either have another adult around, or the local travel transportation policy talks about having either an adult in the car or at least 2 minor athletes. And again, this is all somewhat about prevention and deterrence because, of course, the grooming behaviors usually happen in one-on-one situations. And presumably, if there's another adult or there's 2 minors around, those behavior will be deterred. It's also about having witnesses to what's going on. So I would say that if you have kids in your RV that are your own and they want to have friends spend the night, I don't really think that there's a problem with that if you have the parents' permission, and if there's other people around, which it sounds like there would be. There would be another adult around. There would be more than two other minor athletes. I would just sort of take a belt and suspenders approach and do all of those things. But I wouldn't say suddenly my kids aren't going to have friends over to spend the night, whether it's at an RV or at my house the night before a horse show.
So we have currently need permission slips for individual training sessions, particularly in conjunction with the USEF event. We need permission slips for travel and any hanging out or spending the night in RVs, hotels, homes, that kind of thing. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So are we ready to move to the social media and electronic communications?
Okay. Social media policy and electronic communications policy. Right off the bat, one of the things that jumped out to me is that it didn't talk about phone calls anywhere in these policies. And when I went to USA Swimming, that's one of their frequently asked questions is, what about phone calls? And USA Swimming considers phone calls to be a one-on-one interaction. So I've now jumped back to the one-on-one interaction rule with regard to phone calls. And that kind of threw me for a loop, because I think that, I guess it is a one-on-one interaction if you really think about it. But it's a harder one-on-one interaction to have somebody around. A phone call is not a training session, so I'm not sure that you can get permission to have one-on-one phone calls. I'm just not really sure how phone calls are going to be viewed. So I just throw that out there because, there's pretty detailed stuff about social media and electronic communications like emails or text, but I don't know if they intended this to include phone calls, or if they intended the one-on-one interaction to include phone calls, or if they didn't think about phone calls at all. So social media and electronic communications, in a nutshell, what they want is that you should communicate with a minor professionally and not privately, and in a way that's open and transparent. So sort of like the one-on-one rule only is applied to social media and electronic communications. And again, this is all, if there's emergency circumstances, these rules don't apply. But if there's no emergency circumstances, what they want you to do is essentially have another adult copied on the communications. So if you're going to text Susie to say you need to get your horse to the ring by 10 o'clock in the morning to be ready to show, you need to include another adult, whether it's an assistant trainer or whether it's a parent or somebody else in the barn that's an adult. That's what they're looking for you to do. If a guardian parent asks you to stop communicating with their child, you have to do it. If they ask USEF to stop, USEF has to stop. So it's just, to me, this rule is a little more common sense. It makes sense to me that you can easily copy somebody. Now, in my conversation with another lawyer last week when these rules came out, we talked about, well, what about the situation where you have probably a teenager who is close to a trainer and they're friends. They look up to the trainer and they confide in the trainer, maybe about personal issues. And they send a text that is clearly either a cry for help, or they're confiding in them something about their parent that they're upset about, whatever. What do you tell the trainer to do? I mean, the easy answer is you tell the trainer not to write back, but that's the cruel answer, and that's not good for the child's mental health if they're seeking, a confidant or seeking help. Likewise, you don't want to write back and then CC somebody on a very personal communication. That also is detrimental to a child's mental health, teenager's mental health. We talked about, well, can you just pick up the phone and say, hey, look, I got your message. Sorry, that this is going on. We can talk about it, or we need to talk about it with your parent, or whatever. And I don't know that you can do that you can pick up the phone and make that phone call. And so I think that that's a tough situation to be in, and I don't think that that's an unusual situation, because I think for a lot of us growing up, the horses were our escape, or where we found, confidence and comfort. And I think that that's a little bit of a difficult issue to wrangle with. And the same would apply for, direct messages on social media. Let's talk about that, because that's the required section. The next section is the recommended component section. And underneath the recommended component section, for some reason, it talks about prohibited electronic communication. That doesn't make sense to me. I mean, that's a direct conflict. You can't prohibit something that you're recommending. It's either recommended or it's prohibited. And this is where it talks about, can you be friends with minors on social media? And in this case, and based on an interview that Sonia Keating from USAF gave, it looks like you can be friends with minors on social media. You can't communicate with them directly. And according to her, you don't have to discontinue your connections. But again, this is spelled out differently under here. At least it's recommended that you don't do those things. And so once again, I went to USA Swimming, and they just flatly prohibit it. They just flatly say, applicable adults cannot be friends with minor athletes on social media, period. And that's the end of it for them. So I think these are, interesting issues to tangle with, but I think the concern that I've heard and the concern that I have mostly is where you do have a child, an athlete who is turning to an adult to confide in them, and as the adult, you don't want to make the situation worse for them, and you don't also want to just abandon them and walk away. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is.
I have a concern. So I know we can't direct message according to the new policy, but how do we know? Like, how do we know if the person is under 18? That I don't know everyone that's my friend on. I have 5,000 friends. I don't know all of them. I'm friends with them because of the horse industry, and they follow me because of the post I put up about my horses or horses for sale. So what if one of them direct messages me about a horse or something, and I don't know them directly. I don't know their age. And so all of a sudden I find out they're 16, and now I'm in violation of this policy, not knowing that I am, or not trying to be in violation of a policy. That's frightening to me.
Right. You're answering a question about an ad that you placed that's a horse for sale. And of course, you want to entertain those questions and try to keep this potential buyer on the hook and interested.
Right. And then, so you obviously are going to have probably several messages. They're going to ask you anything about a horse, or about lessons, or they may act like there's somebody they're not. They may act like they're an assistant trainer. But I mean, the whole thing is just a little scary, because we use social media now as a marketing tool. We don't know who we're interacting with.
I think if you write back, just include another adult. So if you have an assistant trainer or your spouse or somebody else who's on that social media platform that you can trust with the information, if you are making, responding, for example, to a sale inquiry and you're talking about price or something that you don't necessarily want to blast out into the world, I think you're fine if you just write back and include an adult on everything, I guess, is the answer. If you're unsure, for sure, include an adult. if you just want to make it a regular practice where you just include somebody else in your business on all your direct communications, electronic communications, then I think that eliminates the problem.
Okay, what if you ask them directly, how old are you, and they lie to you?
Well, I think as long as you include the adult, you don't even have to ask them. You see what I'm saying? If you write back,
I do see what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's just like when somebody asks for a job, or the last thing I think about is including somebody else. Like I don't have a lot of people to include, because I'm kind of a one-man band at my farm. Yes, I have grooms and an assistant, but I don't really want to include them in my business. So it gets a little challenging for a horse trainer, especially if we don't have a huge. I have a huge business, but I don't have a lot of trainer assistants, or
Right.
I don't have a husband that I would include on this, or I certainly don't want to include just anybody on conversations that you would have either with hiring somebody or with sales of horses. So I mean, it's a little bit of a challenge. Again, I know I understand what your answer. It's just very difficult for a lot of trainers to do that. That I'm glad to be a part of this call because I am, as a horse trainer, I am so concerned about obviously the world, but about our industry, and I feel like this has overreached its boundaries in so many situations, and I understand the intent of what Safe Sport is trying to do, but it's very difficult for us as horse trainers to try to abide by all of these new policies. It would adversely affect me if I don't deal with a lot of young children anymore, which I'm glad, and I don't think I will ever have another minor in my barn, which is sad because I really enjoyed teaching and mentoring to the youth. But under these new policies, I mean, like my livelihood could be changed in 2 seconds just by a false accusation, and that's what's so scary to me. So.
And it's frustrating.
It's frustrating when somebody accuses you of something and you're immediately found guilty before you're found innocent, and your whole life has to change and your whole way of making a living has to stop. Then it's not worth it for me to have minors around me ever. So I mean, I hate that because I've taught a lot of great kids to ride, but I don't want to take the risk.
No, I mean, I think for the wrap up, I think the permission slip isn't going to be for everybody. Written permission isn't going to be for everybody. So I think I want people to understand that there's the policy, and then in terms of having another adult around, that's basically the overall policy, is have another adult around. And then for some people that isn't practical or they don't want to do it, then you can look to the narrow things that you can do with parental permission. I just want to make sure people understand that they don't have permission slip. That's just if they don't want to have another adult around.
This concludes our podcast today. On behalf of Shane Darnell and myself, we'd like to thank Melissa and Tammy for joining us. We're posting Tammy's contact information in the event you'd like to reach out to her for assistance with any safe sport or equestrian legal concerns. Thanks.